It's impossible to arrange in any sort of evolutionary series based on just one little bit of facts. You better find all the facts. You find out this evolution theory fails miserably.
On the contrary, when you explore taxonomy, paleontology, embryology, comparing morphology and molecular biology, you see the exact same pattern consistently indicated throughout all of them, that we certainly must have evolved from a common ancestor. There's no other explanation that accounts for any of this, much less all of it at once.
But they tell the kids, we're going to think critically, boys and girls. There are 20 kinds of amino acids, that's a fact. Explain how this fact supports the idea that all life shares a common ancestor. How's a Christian kid supposed to answer that for homework for Monday?
How about if they answer it honestly and explain how these facts support evolution to show that they understand the theory? If they thought these facts did not support the theory, they could explain that too, but they do, and that can be demonstrated.
Don't you see a built-in assumption in this question?
No, because we can think hypothetically, and we can evaluate multiple competing hypotheses at once. If evolution is true, then we should expect A, B, and C, and those are the facts and evidence. If creationism is true, then none of those should be, but they are, and beyond that we should also expect X, Y, and Z, but we don't see any of that. You're welcome to present your own facts in support of creation, but there isn't any. All creationists have are misunderstood, misrepresented misinformation, alternative facts in support of an alternative reality. The place to present your evidence, if you had any, is in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, not in a classroom full of children where all you can do is confuse the undereducated, which is practically the mission statement of creationist apologetics. That's what makes it pseudoscience.
That's not learning to think critically.
Yes, critical thinking is about being able to objectively evaluate what the facts indicate, and about being able to reconsider your own position as the facts demand, rather than simply assuming the truth of unsupported claims based on nothing but an assumption of authority.
Would the kid be allowed, teacher, to explain how this fact that all life forms have 20 amino acids, would the kid be allowed to say, maybe that proves the intelligence of a common designer?
In this context, proof would mean an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. Do you have any evidence of this alleged designer? Can you show that such is even possible? You'd need a lot more than just your own incredulity or your preference to make believe in your favorite folklore, especially when we already know that most of that compilation of fables are definitely not true at all. And your alternate explanation would have to qualify as an explanation by actually explaining things. And just saying, I don't know, therefore magic, doesn't explain anything. And even if it could explain something, which it doesn't, it would also have to account for all the same data that evolution currently does. But creationism cannot even acknowledge most of that. Instead, all you can do is pretend as if none of that is even real. Creationism is no more than a denial of reality to instead assume delusion. Evolution versus creationism is literally fact versus fantasy. And arguing for creationism during a science lecture is a lot like arguing with an obstetrician that they shouldn't teach sexual reproduction because you believe in the stork.
Maybe God gave all the animals the same basic 20 amino acids so that we don't have to just eat each other, you know. I mean, if they're all totally different, wildly different kinds, then we could only eat other humans. But see, God made it this way so the brown cow can eat the green grass and give the white milk and make the yellow butter, and I eat it and get the blonde hair. Maybe that's why there's all the same basic building blocks. Yeah.
Let's evaluate that hypothesis. The preacher alleges that a magical, supernatural being magically conjured, miracled everything out of nothing. Creation ex nihilo, violating the very first law of thermodynamics. I don't know any atheist alive who believes that everything came from nothing, but creationists do believe that, and they like to project their own faults onto others by saying that we believe that too, even when they know we really don't. Anyway, this God they want to make believe in allegedly made all the other animals male and female without realizing that every species starts out the same and that their sex is determined by hormonal development. And the people who made up these stories didn't understand that, and neither does this preacher, as you'll see in the next episode. But the sort of God they propose would have known better. He could have produced pregnant females and just saved himself half the work. But then remember that most creationists, including this preacher, accept that speciation happens, even though they refuse to admit that that's what the word macroevolution means. But speciation means that God didn't have to create every species. Only a few created kinds, such as creationists can never identify. I posted the Phylogeny Challenge more than a decade ago, trying to get these believers to point out 2 or 3 created kinds. They won't do it, because they can't do it, because they already know that there is no such thing. They must know it already, or else they would have at least tried to answer it. But remember, creationism isn't science, it's religion. They're not trying to understand. They want to make believe. And what they believe in most is the power of pretend. Anyway, according to these sacred fables, the method of creation changed when God got around to creating man, because he didn't just wish us into being like he did everything else. Man was created as a golem spell, a magically enchanted, animated clay figurine, just like in the oldest of all creation myths, Enuma Elish, an ancient Babylonian tale on which the first fable in Genesis is largely based. So this God in Genesis is supposed to be an infallible, omniscient being, yet he occasionally regrets the mistakes that he makes. And in this case, he created a man with testicles and nipples for no reason, but the all-knowing deity somehow forgot to create a female. So he performed another spell, taking the man's DNA to create a woman, which contradicts genetics. And the point is that this preacher believes that these 2 enchantments were created perfectly, and that they were immortal, until the mythical character Adam ate the forbidden fruit and brought death into the world. But if they were immortal, then they wouldn't need to eat, would they? But they did need to eat, or else they would die. And we know that because there were 2 magical trees in this story, one cursed and one blessed. Remember that curses and blessings are positive or negative enchantments, and that also counts as magic. Anyway, Adam was given a choice whether to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is obviously a metaphor, never supposed to be seen as a real tree, or he could eat from the fruit of the tree of eternal life. So he chose morality over immortality. That's the moral of the story. At which point, the story says, God had to whisk him out of there, lest he also eat from the fruit of the tree of life, because if he did that, then he would live forever. And remember, he was offered this choice before there was ever a sin. So the story makes clear that Adam did not bring death into the world, but the preacher still believes that he did. So there's a contradiction there. If Adam was immortal, as this preacher believes, and he had free will, as this preacher also contends, then God did not design him to eat the other animals. In fact, the story even says that God provided that Adam could only eat fruit instead of meat. But fruit is an incomplete protein source, such that it is not possible to survive on fruit alone. If you're vegetarian, then you have to mix fruits and nuts, beans and grains and different types of vegetables, because most of them are incomplete on their own. And remember that the definition of an animal is a multicellular eukaryote with an internal digestive tract to ingest and digest other forms of life in order to survive. Either we and the other animals were designed to live forever, or we were designed to eat each other. It can't be both. If God was real, then he could have given us the ability to make our own food like plants do, or he could have given us an ability to be solar powered and not need food at all. But instead, he designed us like he designed all these other animals, such that we have to kill and eat each other. And clearly, the reality is that our design is not deliberate, but a product of natural processes.
One of the lies they face in the textbooks is this idea that all these similarities prove a common ancestor. Well, let's pretend that it does, okay?
Science is not a belief system like religion is, so we don't often say that one fact all by itself is proof of anything. Rather, it's a combination of facts, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence that is all concordant with and indicative of only one possible conclusion without any contradiction. Creationism, on the other hand, has no actual facts to support it whatsoever. It's mired in contradictions, and it's literally not even possible.
This textbook says humans and orangutans are 96% similar, proving a common ancestor 15 million years ago. I don't think so. Humans and chimps have thousands of differences. Thousands of differences.
You know that chimpanzees and orangutans are not the same thing, right? There are 2 distinct species of chimpanzees and 3 species of orangutans, and that's just the ones that are still alive. We used to have more species of each, and the other apes as well, including other species of humans, which is another fact that creationists have to ignore, deny, or misrepresent. There are many more genetic differences between chimpanzees and orangutans than there are between chimpanzees and humans. As Thomas Huxley once said, we are closer to the gorilla than the gorilla is to the baboon. If you look at mitochondrial DNA, for example, there are not thousands of differences, even when it seems like there should be. I wonder how the preacher accounts for the fact that, according to this study, there is an overall average of 128 mutations per human zygote, so that any pair of siblings from the same parent would be, on average, 256 mutations apart, right from the point of conception. And that means that there are thousands of differences, if not tens of thousands of differences, between you and every other stranger that you see in a public place. And these are people who all shared a common ancestor within the last 150,000 years or so. We don't measure genetic differences at this scale because they're not long-term, but if we did, then imagine how many more differences there would be if that divergence began 6 million years ago.
Overall, this guy says the genetic difference is only 1.6%. Oh, that's what they used to think, but that's a lie.
That's not a lie. There are a number of different ways to measure this, as I'll explain in a moment.
Barney Maddox was the leading genome researcher on this project. He said the genetic difference between human and chimpanzee is at least 1.6%. That doesn't sound like much, but calculated out, that's a gap of 48 million nucleotides. And a change of only 3 nucleotides is fatal to an animal. He said it's not going to happen.
Barney Maddox is a creationist. So of course he's going to say that evolution doesn't and can't happen, regardless what the facts are. This is a perfect example of how dishonest creationist quote mining is. And first of all, this is 2 different quotes, both out of context, being stuck together deceptively, when he was actually talking about something else. That decoding of the human genome has allowed scientists to determine that cystic fibrosis is caused by a random change in 3 nucleotides. Someone then snipped a portion of that quote and paraphrased it to make it look like he meant any change of 3 or more nucleotides would be fatal, when really he was only talking about that particular change in those specific ones. We already know that more than that change with consistent regularity.
That's when they thought the difference was 1.6%. It's still too big of a gap. Now then, later they found out, oh, actually it's a 95% similarity, which is 5% difference. And just recently they said, oh no, wow, look at this, it's 7.7% difference.
I don't know where the preacher is getting this 7.7% difference that he keeps bringing up. I looked up the original study and it doesn't say that. Nor could I find anything else that would back that up. All I could find was this chart saying check the difference between the human and chimp genome, and the link to that said that it was 7.7 MB.
The difference, the more we study about this, the worse the problem gets for the evolutionist. Actually, it's becoming worse by the day.
Remember that the preacher said this back in 2005, 16 years ago, and the evolutionary position never got worse on any day, and it was never bad at any point. Nor has the degree of variance between humans and chimps ever actually moved. It just depends on how you measure it. Here's how I explained the difference in measurements a couple years ago. According to one geneticist I've worked with on a number of projects, the 1% number comes from an examination of only the protein-coding DNA regions of the 2 genomes and only includes heritable single nucleotide differences. It ignores the changes on the larger level: loss of whole genes, rearrangement of gene order, loss or gain of regions or chromosomes. For example, at some point after our separation from what would become chimpanzees, 2 of their chromosomes were fused into 1 in us, and biologists have identified the exact location and signatures of that fusion. Once these trees branched, we've been growing further and further apart by building up unique differences ever since, wherein we're not just talking about point mutations, but where whole blocks of genes could, with a single mutation, be accidentally eliminated from one genome or duplicated in the other, though these typically tend to be in the non-coding regions. If you include these additional changes, the difference between chimp and human genomes climbs to 4%, and researchers believe that these large-scale changes may have played a bigger role in our evolution from a common ancestor with chimpanzees. There is no question in the minds of anyone studying the comparative genomics of chimp and human that they are our closest cousins. And not just because the degree of homology or genetic similarity is high, but because of the specific signatures of selection. According to this study, the oft-repeated 1% difference still applies to amino acid sequences, the part that's exposed to purifying selection/evolution. The sequences between chimp and human are 99% identical, but only 96% identical if you count the total differences that represent the genes or the regions around the genes, the intergenic regions. And the author says, the search for functionally important differences is further complicated because many of the important ones may not be within known coding sequences. So we're looking at virtually identical similarity in the coding DNA, and nearly all the differences are in non-coding DNA. Why is that? Well, according to another geneticist I know, the evidence of taxonomic relationships is overwhelming when you look at the comparisons between genomic DNA sequences of both closely related and even distantly related species. The DNA of yeast and humans shares over 30% homology with regard to gene sequences. Comparison of the human and mouse genome shows that only 1% of the genes in either genome fails to have an ortholog with the other genome. Comparison of the non-gene sequences, on the other hand, shows a huge amount of divergence. This type of homology can be explained only from descent from a common ancestor. The probability of these things being a coincidence, which I guess would be the argument of creationism and intelligent design, is statistically so small as to be negligible. So whole genomic comparisons have confirmed a definite relationship, kind of like doing a genetic test to determine paternity. But we're not just trying to identify your father or tracing your grandfather's grandfathers, though they can do that now too. We are going much, much further back than that.
This result is based on only 1 million DNA bases out of 3 billion. They've only analyzed 1/3000th of the human DNA code. A very small percent has actually been analyzed. French and American scientists have mapped chromosome 14, the longest sequence to date, and the site of more than 60 disease genes. The feat enlisted nearly 100 researchers and marks the 4th of the 24 human chromosomes mapped so far.
Now this is interesting. The preacher almost never cites scientific papers because he doesn't read them. He's in an echo chamber where he only reads claims made by other creationists. In this case, I was able to find the source they were referring to. A pop media article talking about how scientists found 60 disease genes in chromosome 14, including one linked to early onset of Alzheimer's, as well as spastic paraplegia, Niemann-Pick disease, and a severe form of Usher syndrome. These are not disease resistance genes. These are not disease fighting genes. These are susceptibilities, vulnerable weaknesses that the preacher would have us believe were deliberately written into our gene code. Why would his God write diseases or the probability of suffering such diseases into our genome?
If somebody tells you they have mapped the entire human genome, you tell them Kent Hovind said they're mistaken or they're lying. Okay? They've only mapped a small percentage. Okay?
Remember that the preacher said this back in 2005.
Then it says, the French National Sequencing Center said the chromosome is comprised of more than 87 million pairs of DNA, all of which have been sequenced, so the chromosome's map includes no gaps. This is the longest piece of contiguous DNA sequenced.
Comparative studies of human and ape chromosomes show much more similarity than this preacher will admit. And more than that, they show specific smoking gun evidence of our genetic divergence from the other apes. For example, I'll put a link below to this excellent lecture on evolution versus intelligent design by biologist Ken Miller.
Many of you may know that a few months ago the genetic code of the chimpanzee was published. Therefore, we can compare our genome to these primate relatives. What do we find? I want to show you one striking finding that dates to about a year ago. You all know that evolution argues that we share a common ancestor with the great apes, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the orangutan. Well, if that's true, there should be genetic similarities, and in fact there are. But there's something that's really interesting and has the potential, if it were true, to contradict evolutionary common ancestry. And that is, we have 2 fewer chromosomes than the other great apes. We have 46, they all have 48. That's very interesting. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, first of all, the 46 chromosomes that we have, you got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. So it's actually 23 pairs. These guys have 24 from each parent, so they have 24 pairs. So everybody in this room is missing a pair of chromosomes. Now, where did it go? Could it have gotten lost in our lineage? If it got lost, if a whole primate chromosome was lost, That would be lethal. So there's only two possibilities. And that is, if these guys really share a common ancestor, that ancestor either had 48 chromosomes or 46. Now, if it had 48, 24 pairs, which is probably true, because 3 out of 4 have 48 chromosomes, what must have happened is that one pair of chromosomes must have gotten fused. So we should be able to look at our genome and discover that one of our chromosomes resulted from the fusion of 2 primate chromosomes. So we should be able to look around our genome. And you know what? If we don't find it, evolution is wrong. We don't share a common ancestor. So how would we find it? Well, biologists in the room will know that chromosomes have nifty little markers. They have markers called centromeres, which are DNA sequences that are used to separate them during mitosis, and they have cool little DNA sequences on the end called telomeres. What would happen if a pair of chromosomes got fused? Well, what would happen is the fusion would put telomeres where they don't belong, in the center of the chromosome, and the resulting fused chromosome should actually have 2 centromeres. One of them might become inactivated, but nonetheless it should still be there. So we can scan our genome, and you know what? If we don't find that chromosome, evolution's in trouble. Well, guess what? It's chromosome number 2. Our chromosome number 2 was formed by the fusion of 2 primate chromosomes. This is the paper from Nature a little more than a year ago. And I put up a little of the paper. I'm sorry it's technical, but look at what it says. Chromosome 2 is unique to our lineage. It emerged as a result of the head-to-head fusion of 2 chromosomes that remain separate in other primates. Those of you who have not kept up with how much we know about the genome should pay attention to this, because you'll be amazed at how precisely we can look at things. The precise fusion site has been located at base number 114,455,823 to 114,455,838. In other words, within 15 bases. And you'll notice multiple subtelomeric duplications, the telomeres that don't belong, and lo and behold, the centromere that is inactivated corresponds to chimp chromosome 13. It's there, it's testable, it confirms the prediction of evolution. How would intelligent design explain this? Only one way, by shrugging and saying, that's the way the designer made it. No reason, no rhyme. Presumably there's a designer who designed human chromosome number 2 to make it look as if it was formed by the fusion from a private ancestor. I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm a theist. In the broadest sense, I would say I believe in a designer, but you know what? I don't believe in a deceptive one. I don't believe in one who would do this to try to fool us. And therefore, I think this is authentic, and it tells us something about our ancestry.
87 million pairs, a fraction of the total 3 billion pairs found in the human genome. They still don't know how much there's in there, and it's already 7.7% difference.
I'll include another link below to this other presentation by a developmental biologist explaining exactly what the majority of our genome is already known to be.
So we know that 45% of your genome, adding up all those categories there, is known parasitic DNA. Please call it junk. It's junk. It's not functional. It's not to your advantage to have this stuff. 10% is structural DNA, and 5% is functional. That's the coding sequence, the regulatory sequences, tRNAs, all that kind of stuff. So we can account for about 60% of the genome, and about half of it is garbage. Now, there's that remaining 40%. We don't know. We're working on it. That other 40% is job security for molecular biologists. And the scientists are working their way through it. And we can make some predictions based on past performance. We can say, okay, what we expect to find is that most of this will be garbage. It won't be functional. It will just be random sequences. We already know, for instance, that another 1.5% are pseudogenes. These are broken genes that no longer function.
This researcher said, human genome is littered with up to 20,000 pseudogenes. That proves evolution. I get this in debates all the time. They'll say, what about the pseudogenes? I said, there's no such thing. They say, well, yeah, there are thousands of pseudo, which means a false gene. It doesn't do anything. Oh, no. Those pseudogenes serve several purposes. Number one, they serve as decoys to draw poisons away from the real ones.
So the pseudogenes draw poisons away from the real genes? That makes the pseudogenes false genes. which is what the word pseudogene means. So the preacher says that pseudogenes don't exist, while also explaining exactly how and why they actually do exist. Except that he's wrong about even that, of course. And when has he ever been right about anything? Pseudogenes, by definition, are non-functional, usually broken genes, incomplete, lacking regulatory information. They have sequences that are partial copies of functional elements, but with deleted promoter regions, or they're deactivated by frameshift mutations, or what have you.
Number two, they serve as backup mechanism. It's like your computer has an automatic backup. You know, if a piece of the memory gets destroyed, another one of those pseudogenes jumps right in, takes over.
No, they don't. There is no mechanism by which they could do that, and no means for the cell to select a backup if the primary broke down. The way the preacher describes this is not how computers work, and it's not how genetics work either. What he's saying doesn't make any applicable sense. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what a pseudogene is because he doesn't know what a gene is. And that much was already obvious even before I talked to a couple of geneticists about this. Pseudogenes are not a backup mechanism. They can't be, because they accumulate mutations at a faster rate than the functional sequences that are maintained by selection. So they're degraded, containing far more errors than the damaged functional sequence.
No, there's not. They took out some of the pseudogenes to see what would happen. They said, well, the mouse doesn't need these things, let's take them out. And there's how they turned out. They were deformed terribly.
No, they weren't. I don't know where the preacher got this picture, apparently from a completely different study of something else entirely, of experiments on transgenic monstrosities, perhaps. Who knows? But wherever he found that picture, it does not match the peer-reviewed documentation. Again, I must defer to someone else who knows more about this than me or the preacher.
Hi, my name's Crystal. I graduated from Texas A&M University with a degree in agricultural leadership and development with emphasis in genetics and biochemistry. I also researched in several labs on campus in genetics. Well, one thing that researchers are particularly interested in is finding out what is junk DNA and does it actually do anything? One recent study suggests that it really doesn't. Researchers took 2.3 million letters of DNA out of a mouse and compared it to a mouse with full-length version of DNA and found out that there are no differences whatsoever.
No such thing as a pseudogene. The pseudogene may function as a decoy to lure away destructive enzymes. Discover Magazine of '03.
That can't be right either. So I looked it up and, oh look, there are those mutant mice. Are these the ones that had millions of letters of junk DNA removed? No. These mice had fruit fly genes inserted into their DNA as embryos, which disrupted normal development. So they are transgenic monsters. That's why they were deformed terribly. What they discovered here was a rare instance in which the actual gene functions with the support of a particular type of pseudogene. Kind of see it as a crutch, perhaps.
There will be some surprises in there. There will be some fragments of that DNA that actually have function. And every time one of those is found, the creationists will announce, aha, we were right. The genome is fully functional. You have just found 0.001% of the genome that does something.
We could spend all day on DNA sequencing, but...
No, I don't think the preacher could pretend to understand any more of this. He was clearly out of his depth from the start.
You know, it could be. We have similar DNA to other animals because we have the same designer.
No, that cannot be. We know that evolution is possible and that it happens under direct observation. But there is neither precedent, nor parallel, nor verified phenomenon to indicate that this alleged creator is even possible. And it is by definition impossible, since miracles are defined as defying the laws of physics, making them and God both physically impossible. And belief in this God requires that we ignore everything that we can show that we really do know about evolution.
You know, similar bridges would have similar blueprints, wouldn't they? Similar cars would have similar instructions on how to build them, how to make them.
But if any mystical designers really existed, then what we see in nature looks like the work of competing teams of designers, all of whom are so conservative that none of them will redesign anything from the ground up to improve it. They'll only make subtle adjustments in physical or chemical proportions. That's it. Exactly what evolution would already do without any designers.
Man has a pretty good understanding of how cars work. My daddy started us boys off working on cars when we were, 7 years old. I've had 128 cars, I believe. I've rebuilt the motors, the transmissions, the wobulator shafts, the differentials, the high-speed Canootin valves, and the muffler bearings. I have a pretty good understanding of how cars work. But understanding the operation of a car does not explain the origin of the car. Big difference. See? Let's suppose your son turns 16. All of my kids did a few years ago. Your son comes up and says, "Hey, Dad, I got my license." "Let me see that thing, son. Let me see your license. Come on." "Wow, son, that's a lousy picture." It is a good likeness, though. He says, "Hey, Dad, can I drive the car?" "Well, son, your mom and I knew this day was coming. The car is a very complicated machine. Did you know there are 3,000 bolts required to hold a car together, and one nut can scatter it all over the highway? We don't think you're ready for the whole car, son. We're going to let you slowly evolve into the car. This year we're going to give you 10%. Next year maybe just a little more." Hey, what good is 10% of a car? That's what you put in a junkyard. How many things have to be right on a car to make it work? Like thousands of things? How many things would have to be wrong to make it stop working? Any one of the many thousands of things. Like not having the keys, you know, not having any gas in it, you know. Take the distributor cap off and run a pencil around the inside and put it back on. Boy, they'll never find that one. Take the spark plug wire off, put a doorbell wire in there, shove it back down, feed the doorbell wire through the firewall, and weave it through the fabric of the front seat. Do that when they're going on their honeymoon, you know, get in the car. "Wow, let's go, honey." Bam! Ooh. Ooh, what was that? Okay. There's 1,000 things that make your car quit running. Probably 10,000 ways to stop a car from running. Shove a potato in the exhaust pipe, you know, watch what happens. I don't want to give you any more ideas, okay? But
If only this preacher had some idea what he was talking about. There was never a precursor to any animal alive today that was less than 100% of whatever it was. Our evolutionary ancestors were not 30%, 50%, or 70% human. Our species is hopefully not the end product, so we certainly wouldn't say that we are 80% of whatever we will become.
there are thousands of differences between humans and chimpanzees. But if you think a percentage of similarity proves a relationship, let me show you the research I've been doing. I discovered clouds are 100% water. Watermelons are 97%. It's only 3% difference. That proves they're related. Jellyfish are 98%. Missing link. And so are snow cones. Yeah, there we go. We got the proof, okay?
When I first heard this exact argument, it was a different preacher, some old man talking on a radio show when I was only 11 years old, way back in 1974. Yeah, I know. I'm a boomer. And whoever that was, he said that watermelons are just 98% water, and a watermelon only missed out on being a cloud by 2%. What struck me, even as an 11-year-old boy, was what a dishonest argument that was. It's not just that that argument is made of logical fallacies, straw-manning evolution, ignoring every part of the reality, but I couldn't understand why someone, a grown-up, would say something so incredibly stupid and willfully ignorant. It took me years to learn what Carl Sagan already knew, that there are those who don't want to merely believe, they want to know and improve their understanding. And there are those who, amazingly, don't want to know and don't want to learn. They have no curiosity and have only a deep-seated need to believe things that just aren't true. Will you go lay down? I am trying to record. Do not. Do not. Go lay down. No, no, no. Go lay down. All of you.